the village of Nether Durnham, where the ivy crept up every brick cottage and roses bowed gently under the weight of their own bloom, the most thrilling thing that usually happened was the vicar's sermon running 5 minutes late. Life unfolded with the quiet rhythm of teacups, curtain twitching, and the subtle choreography of gossip exchanged over garden gates. That Tuesday morning had begun no differently. The sun blinked through scattered clouds, children dawdled on their way to school, and Mrs. Penelope Hargreaves was already on her third pot of Earl Grey. Yet something was off. It was nearly 10:30, and the post had not arrived. In Nether Durnham, the post always arrived by 10. Mr. Thomas Larkin, the village postman for nearly 14 years, prided himself on punctuality, so unwavering that several of the older residents had been known to set their clocks by the squeak of his bicycle wheels. Mrs. Hargreaves had just begun grumbling about this rare delay when she noticed something even more troubling. Thomas Larkin's bicycle stood abandoned near the war memorial, its front wheel tilted into the hedge like a drunken bow. The post sack was slung across the handlebars, full and unopened. The village seemed to hold its breath. Within the hour, 3 separate neighbours had confirmed that Thomas hadn't been seen that morning. The baker's boy hadn't heard him whistle. Old Mr. Catamole at the edge of the village, who received nothing but bills, reported with some alarm that he hadn't had a bill in 2 days. By noon, Constable Sims had been summoned from the next parish, his face flushed and uncertain. He cordoned off the bicycle as if it were a crime scene, though no one quite knew what the crime was. A search party was organised. Miss Marple, knitting half forgotten in the corner of her niece's drawing room, merely looked up once and said, "Oh dear, that's not like him at all." By mid-afternoon, they found him, or rather, they found what was left of him. Thomas Larkin's body was discovered in the pond behind St. Ethelburga's chapel, floating face down among the reeds. The constable said it must have been an accident. Poor fellow slipped in, perhaps had a stroke. He'd been under some strain, apparently. There were mutterings of debts and a falling out with a brother in Woking. But Miss Marple, who had known Thomas since he was a boy delivering letters with an awkward blush and a cowlick he never could tame, simply said, "Nonsense." She said it quite softly, of course, just to herself, as she turned from the police line and walked slowly away. Her eyes, pale and intelligent, swept the scene one more time. There had been no letters delivered that day, and for a postman, Miss Marple thought that was the strangest thing of all. The village of Nether Durnham did not take well to disturbance. For decades, it had guarded its peace like a secret, defending it with the polite ferocity of flower shows, parish council meetings, and a collective disdain for novelty. But now a postman was dead, and the post sack had not been touched, and no one could quite remember the last time something truly bad had happened. By evening, the news had slithered through every lane, hedge, and alley. Mrs. Hargreaves had spoken to Mrs. Denby, who had told Mrs. Fenton, who had whispered to her lodger, who had rushed down to the grocer's, where it was overheard by Reverend McInnes buying ginger biscuits. He had dropped the biscuits. "It's a terrible tragedy," he said solemnly, repeating the phrase so often in the span of an hour that it began to sound rehearsed. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." "I don't believe the Lord had much to do with it," muttered Mrs. Price, the widow who ran the dry goods shop and had no patience for vague theology. By the time dusk curled around the village rooftops and church bells chimed the hour in mild confusion, theories had multiplied like ivy. Some were wildly imaginative, a passing stranger, a vagrant with a knife, foreign agents even, courtesy of young Peter Ellison, who read far too many spy novels. Others were more grounded. Thomas had slipped, poor soul, or perhaps he'd finally succumbed to that nervousness he'd been displaying lately. It was true, many agreed, that Thomas Larkin hadn't quite been himself these past few weeks. He had been seen lingering outside the vicarage gate one morning, not knocking, just standing as if unsure of his purpose. Another time, he'd been overheard muttering in the Rose and Crown about someone watching his rounds. He had knocked over a milk bottle, stammered an apology, and left without finishing his pint. Still, no one could explain why the post sack was untouched. The bag had been full, just as it would be when he collected it from the sorting office. Yet not a single letter had been delivered. "Does that not strike anyone as peculiar?" Miss Marple asked gently over tea at Mrs. Banbury's, as several neighbours gathered to share their alarm and overbaked scones. "Oh, I imagine he must have felt poorly, dear," Mrs. Banbury said quickly, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "Felt faint and meant to sit down, and then, well, fell into the pond." Miss Marple looked at her hostess with soft, almost maternal patience. "But if one felt faint, wouldn't one sit on the bench near the chapel? Or perhaps lean on the gate? Thomas Larkin had been delivering letters in this village since 1939. He knew the route well. He knew where to rest if he needed to. The room fell quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mrs. Prowse, who rarely spoke unless stirred by strong sentiment, cleared her throat. He didn't have any reason to be by the pond. That path doesn't run by the pond, you see. It cuts through the green, past the postbox, and then down toward the butcher's. He'd never go behind the chapel unless he was following someone. Miss Marple tilted her head. Yes, or meeting someone. That single suggestion was enough to ignite the room. Mrs. Denby clutched her pearls and offered a list of possible liaisons. Mr. Harcourt, the retired schoolmaster, mumbled something about moral decay and was ignored. Miss Marple, for her part, simply sipped her tea and listened. What intrigued her more than the speculation was the behaviour it concealed. Some in the room were genuinely distraught. Others seemed excited, enlivened by the sudden stir of mystery. But one or two were notably tense. Mrs. Agnes Whittle, who prided herself on knowing the precise number of eggs every villager bought each week, had spoken very little and kept glancing at the clock. Young Geoffrey Banbury, home from university for the summer, had lingered in the hall rather than join the gathering, and once dropped his teacup when someone mentioned the word police. It was a particular phrase, however, that caused Miss Marple to pause in her musings. It came from Mrs. Prowse again, almost offhandedly. "I suppose the letters will be delayed a day or two, though I expect it won't matter much. No one gets anything interesting anymore." Miss Marple set down her cup. No one gets anything interesting anymore. It was not true, of course. In a village like Nether Durnham, letters were often the most interesting things of all. There were still sisters who wrote longhand from Cornwall, adult children who sent cheques for rent, discreet bills, charity requests, birthday cards, and every now and then, though no one ever admitted it, letters with no return address, tucked carefully away before spouses could glance at them. If Thomas had failed to deliver even one of those letters, someone might be anxious indeed. The next morning, the police returned in full presence, now joined by a plain-clothed inspector from the county. Inspector Mallory, lean, pale, and quietly annoyed, stood at the edge of the pond and scowled. "It's clean," he muttered. "No sign of a struggle. Medical examiner says no trauma, no head wound, no blood. Lungs full of water. He drowned." "But he couldn't have fallen," Constable Sims said uncertainly. "There's no slope." "Exactly," said Mallory. "So what the hell was he doing here?" Miss Marple, who had quietly wandered by with her basket of wool, gave the inspector a small smile and murmured, "One does sometimes walk where they're summoned, even if the path is unusual." Mallory glanced at her, barely suppressing impatience. "Yes, thank you, madam." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly and kept walking, but she had seen something else, a scrap of paper at the edge of the path, torn, water-stained, half buried in mud. No one else noticed. She waited until the men had turned their backs, then stooped to tie her shoelace and tucked the piece into her basket. Back in her sitting room, she held it to the light. It was no longer legible in full, but two things could be made out. "Never meant for you to see this," and below, in slightly neater handwriting, 8:30 behind chapel. So Thomas had been meeting someone. He had come expecting a message, perhaps even this very letter, and had ended up drowned. Miss Marple sat back and folded her hands in her lap. The murderer, she thought, was someone who knew what Thomas might have seen. Someone who had something to lose if a letter was read. She looked out the window toward the chapel spire, just visible beyond the hedgerows, and whispered, "There is never a crime so plain it needn't be read between the lines." And in Nether Durnham, where secrets lingered longer than footprints, she suspected the letter that had never been delivered might matter more than anyone yet realized. The morning after the discovery of the waterlogged scrap, Miss Marple sat near her window as the sky turned from ash to soft blue. Her knitting needles were idle in her lap, the half-finished shawl forgotten. The torn message sat on the small table beside her, gently weighted by a porcelain sugar bowl. She had dried it carefully overnight, but the paper was fragile, the ink smudged at its edges. Still, the time and place remained. 8:30, behind chapel. Not a phrase to dismiss lightly. Miss Marple had never been fond of melodrama. She did not chase shadows or indulge in excitement, but she had learned, through a lifetime of quiet observation, that people rarely lied without reason, and even more rarely told the full truth when they had something to protect. Thomas Larkin had been scheduled to meet someone that night. He had gone, punctual no doubt, as he always was, and now he was dead. That morning, while the village still stretched its limbs and yawned into the day, Miss Marple took her usual stroll, a habit no one questioned. She made her way to the churchyard, her cane clicking softly along the stone path. The pond behind St. Ethelburga's glistened in the early light, unassuming, innocent, a shallow mirror, framed by reeds and soft moss. Nothing in its still surface betrayed what had happened there just 2 days before. She wandered slowly along the perimeter, stopping occasionally to examine the ground. The police had combed the area, but they hadn't been looking for subtleties. Footprints in dry grass, broken bracken, or places where someone might have stood and waited. A patch of flattened weeds just beside the low chapel wall caught her attention. Not wide enough for a scuffle, but certainly where someone had crouched or stood for some time. From there, one could see the path leading in from the green, where Thomas would have approached. She knelt, carefully, her fingers brushing a slender object half hidden in the grass. A button. It was plain, black, the kind often found on waistcoats or cardigans. No crest or mark, nothing to declare its origin, except for a pale thread still caught in its back, the colour of cream. Miss Marple pocketed it without a sound. As she rose to her feet, the chapel bell tolled softly behind her, not for any service, but because the sacristan had begun cleaning for Sunday. A thin young man in shirt sleeves and scuffed shoes, Oliver Trent, had been appointed just last year. He nodded at Miss Marple and gave her a tired smile. "Bit eerie back here these days, isn't it?" She returned the smile with one of her own. "The pond's still as ever, but still waters do sometimes conceal more than they reflect, don't they?" He blinked at her, then shrugged. "Suppose so. Never did like walking home past it after dusk." "You were here late the night Mr. Larkin disappeared, weren't you?" she asked gently, not accusing, just inquiring. "Tidying the vestry, I believe." Oliver nodded again, this time more guardedly. "Yeah, Reverend McInnes had me sort through old hymnals. I left just before 9. Didn't see anything odd, though. Just fog." "Did you happen to see Mr. Larkin?" "No, Mum, not that I can remember." She thanked him, and he ducked back into the chapel, as if glad to retreat from the morning's questions. That same afternoon, the inquest was formally postponed. Inspector Mallory had taken over the local station and had summoned several villagers for questioning. Most were eager to assist, or at least to speculate, but a few were not. Agnes Whittle, for example, flatly refused to answer questions about whether Thomas Larkin had ever mentioned her name. When pressed, she grew agitated and declared she had nothing to do with love letters or dead men in ponds. Which was odd, Miss Marple thought, since no one had suggested the word love letter until she had. Later, in the Rose and Crown, the conversation swirled like smoke around the tables. Mr. Harcourt muttered darkly about town nonsense and metropolitan interference, and Geoffrey Banbury nursed a whisky with shaking hands. The post sack, still sealed, still heavy, had been sent to the central office for cataloguing. Inspector Mallory had hinted that they might soon discover whether anything had been removed from it, but Miss Marple doubted it. No, she thought, if something had been taken, it hadn't been from the sack. It had been added, or more likely, replaced. She stopped briefly at the dry goods shop on her way home, buying 2 jars of jam and a tin of ginger biscuits she didn't need. It was a convenient excuse to speak to Mrs. Price. "Terrible, isn't it?" the shopkeeper said, wrapping the tins slowly. "The whole business makes you wonder if you really know the people around you." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "I suppose Mr. Larkin must have been delivering something that someone didn't want delivered." Mrs. Price stiffened for a heartbeat, then offered a too bright smile. "Well, I suppose you could say that about most of the post. Not everyone's fond of surprises." "No," Miss Marple said, "but it's rare that surprises end in ponds." She paused, adjusting the hem of her sleeve. "I do hope you didn't lose anything important in the post that morning." Mrs. Price blinked. "What makes you think I was expecting anything?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said lightly. "Only you've always ordered your spices from Norwich by letter, haven't you? And it's usually a Tuesday when they arrive." The older woman's lips tightened. "I found other suppliers." "Of course," Miss Marple said, with a kind smile. As she turned to leave, she heard the faintest sigh behind her. By evening, Miss Marple had begun to lay out her notes. Not literal ones, that wasn't her way. But she arranged her thoughts with the same methodical care she used for embroidery, loop by loop, building a pattern of behaviour. Someone in the village had lured Thomas to the chapel. Someone who had either written or intercepted a letter. Someone nervous enough to confront him, but desperate enough to silence him when that confrontation went wrong. And she knew, with the clarity that age and pattern recognition granted, that the letter had not been random. It had been deeply personal, not a matter of war or crime or politics, but of shame, inheritance, or affection. These were the motives that ran deep in quiet villages. Miss Marple lit the fire, watching the glow climb the logs like slow fingers. She knew the rhythm now, the pace of the unspoken, the weight of silence. It wouldn't be long before another secret surfaced, or another person disappeared. The following morning, the clouds hung low over Nether Durnham, pressing a grey hush over the cottages and narrow lanes. Rain had fallen lightly during the night, not enough to soak the earth, but just enough to make the flagstones slick and the hedges glisten with droplets like silver pins. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen window, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze on the distant chapel spire, which peered through mist like a watchful eye. She was waiting for something. Not news exactly, but behaviour. Small signs in the people around her. The subtle flinches and glances that so often betrayed more than words ever could. It was never the confession that solved the mystery she knew, but the contradiction, the moment when someone, in trying to conceal the truth, revealed far more than they intended. By 10 o'clock, she had wrapped herself in her rain shawl and set off toward the high street, walking past the post office, now temporarily closed and locked under heavy blinds. A single notice on the door read, "All postal operations will resume shortly. We thank you for your patience." A new face had appeared in the village, a substitute postman, drafted hastily from East Bramley. He was younger, taller than Thomas, and clearly uncomfortable with the attention he drew. As he cycled past, Miss Marple gave him a polite nod, which he returned with something between confusion and fear. Everyone in Nether Durnham had looked at him that way for the past 3 days, as if he were a ghost in the uniform of the man who should have come instead. At the corner grocer's, talk had not died down. Mrs. Penelope Hargreaves was deep in conversation with Reverend McInnes, their tones hushed but urgent. "I tell you," she said, "it wasn't an accident. I knew something like this would happen eventually. Not with Thomas perhaps, but with someone. Now, the vicar said gently, adjusting his wire spectacles. This is not a time for hysteria. Hysteria? She whispered. You weren't the one who saw Agnes Whittle tear up that note in the bin behind her shop. Full of nerves she was, pale as skimmed milk. Are you certain it was a note? Number. But I am certain she was watching the chapel path. Miss Marple selected a small bag of barley sugar from the shelf and cleared her throat just enough to signal her presence. Both parties fell instantly quiet. Reverend McInnes offered her a nod. Miss Marple, he said, with the tone of one who has already rehearsed his own innocence. I trust you're keeping well. Well enough, she replied, though I admit I find it unsettling when people begin tearing up papers in secret. Mrs. Hargreaves flushed and busied herself with the tins. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, and Miss Marple made her way to the library, a modest building, sparsely populated even on ordinary days. Behind the counter sat Eleanor Broom, the librarian, with her usual neatness. Hairpinned, cardigan buttoned to the throat, and spectacles low on her nose. She barely looked up when Miss Marple entered, though her hand paused slightly over the date stamp. You haven't seen Mr. Banbury today, have you? Miss Marple asked, selecting a gardening book and placing it gently on the desk. Eleanor looked up sharply. No, she said too quickly. Not since Tuesday. Why? Oh, no reason. Only I'd heard he sometimes helps with your shelving. You're short-staffed since the junior assistant left, aren't you? Eleanor hesitated. Yes, though Geoffrey is hardly the most reliable volunteer. Miss Marple smiled. No, I dare say he isn't. She took her book and left without further remark, but something about the librarian's response had not sat comfortably with her. Eleanor had not denied seeing Geoffrey, only reacted as though the very question were dangerous, which meant perhaps that someone else had seen him, and she was uncertain how much Miss Marple already knew. Geoffrey Banbury was not an unpleasant boy, merely one with too much imagination and too few boundaries. Miss Marple had seen his type before, clever enough to feel superior, careless enough to think the rules applied only to others, and he had been drinking the night of Thomas's death. That much the innkeeper had confirmed. But it was not Geoffrey's actions that concerned Miss Marple most. It was his fear, not guilt, not yet, but the fear of being seen. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a brief note and asked young Daniel Roper to deliver it. The boy, always eager for a task that felt important, trotted off toward the Banbury residence with the folded envelope in hand. Its contents were simple. Would you mind stopping by for tea tomorrow at 4? I find myself with too many biscuits and too many questions. J.M. The following day, precisely at 4, Geoffrey arrived. His hair was slicked back too neatly, his shoes freshly polished, all signs of someone overcompensating. Miss Marple, who wore her oldest cardigan and a welcoming smile, received him with the ease of a doting great-aunt. I hope you don't mind fruitcake, she said, as they sat in the sunroom. Though I always say people reveal more over sponge, don't you think? Geoffrey blinked. Sorry. She poured the tea. Well, I've never trusted confessions made over coffee. Far too bitter. Whereas sponge cake, yes, that's when people let their guard down. Something about the familiarity of it. He gave a nervous chuckle. You think I have something to confess? Oh, goodness, no, she said quickly. But you do know something, don't you? His smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Geoffrey, you were at the Rose and Crown the night Mr. Larkin died. Several people saw you leave just before 8. That would give you more than enough time to walk to the chapel. She didn't interrupt. She waited. He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the window, then back again. I went to meet someone, he whispered. Not Thomas. A girl. Eleanor. Miss Marple allowed a slight blink of surprise. Miss Broom? She told me not to tell anyone. She was scared. Said people would talk. Said her father would cut her off if he found out she was, well, if she was seeing someone beneath her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did you meet her? Geoffrey hesitated. I waited near the chapel for half an hour. She never came. I got cold and went home, that's all. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. Did you see Mr. Larkin? No. Did you hear anything? Just a splash. That was enough. After Geoffrey left, flustered, ashamed and somewhat relieved, Miss Marple sat down once more at her small writing desk. A pattern was beginning to form. Eleanor had lied. Geoffrey had been lured there. And someone, not Geoffrey, not Eleanor, had used the meeting spot as cover. The letter Thomas had received had been false. A decoy. And someone else had written it. She took the button from its envelope and laid it beside the dried fragment of the letter. The thread matched the cream wool of a cardigan she'd seen just once, worn by someone standing stiffly behind a shop counter, eyes narrowed, voice guarded. She looked toward the lamplight and whispered, Agnes Whittle, what did you see that day? The village held its breath. Something was unraveling, and Miss Marple, thread by thread, was drawing it toward her needles. By the next morning, the mood in Nether Durnham had turned taut, like linen stretched on an embroidery hoop. The rain had returned with a steady drizzle, smudging the outlines of the village into blurred edges of green and grey. The puddles on the cobbled road shimmered like melted glass, and the hedgerows seemed to lean inward, listening. Miss Marple sat in the parlour with her hands folded loosely over a letter she had penned, but not yet sealed. It was addressed to Inspector Mallory, and though brief, it contained several pointed questions. She had debated sending it, but she knew Mallory, like most men in uniform, preferred theories to come with hard facts, or, at the very least, with an appearance of logic dressed in courtesy. What she had were observations, inconsistencies, and a button. So instead of sending the letter, she tucked it into her recipe book for safekeeping, poured herself a second cup of tea, and turned her attention to the matter of Agnes Whittle. Miss Marple knew the value of silence, and Agnes had grown noticeably silent since the day of the discovery. It wasn't just grief or fear. It was that bristling, rigid quiet of someone desperately trying to hold a boundary, as though one careless word might undo everything. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter and set out for the village, not toward Agnes's shop directly, but toward the Rose and Crown, where rumours fermented more efficiently than the cider. It was 10:30 when she entered, and only 2 patrons sat hunched at their tables, Mr. Catamole with his crossword, and Mrs. Denby with her thick knitting and a look of mild irritation, likely from discovering she'd dropped a stitch several rows back. Miss Marple offered them a polite greeting and approached the bar. Young Sarah, the innkeeper's daughter, was wiping down glasses and humming under her breath. She brightened at the sight of the elderly woman. "Morning, Miss Marple. Bit damp out again." "It is indeed, dear. I always think drizzle suits villages better than sunshine, don't you? Gives people an excuse to linger inside and think things over." Sarah smiled, unsure whether this was idle talk or the beginning of something more pointed. "I wondered," Miss Marple continued gently, "if Agnes Whittle has been in recently." Sarah's hands paused over the cloth. "Yesterday evening. Sat alone. Didn't drink much, just a sherry. Looked miserable." "Did she speak to anyone?" "Number except the barman once. Asked if we'd had any letters go astray lately. Seemed odd, considering." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And what did he say?" Sarah gave a small shrug. "Told her no one had mentioned anything. We're hardly a post office." Miss Marple nodded, as though this satisfied a curiosity, and turned to leave. But it had confirmed something for her. Agnes was watching more than just her own shop window. She was waiting for fallout. That meant the letter Thomas had, or hadn't, delivered, had something to do with her. As Miss Marple stepped back out into the wet morning, her thoughts returned to the button. The thread still clinging to it had been identical to the yarn used in Agnes's pale cream cardigan, one she had worn, tellingly, every Sunday, and had not been seen in since the morning of the murder. A cardigan that, when worn, closed up to the neck, hiding the fact that one button was now missing. By 11 o'clock, Miss Marple had arrived at the dry goods shop. Agnes Whittle was behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, rearranging tins of syrup with a forcefulness that suggested either stress or a poor night's sleep. Her hair, always tidily plaited and pinned, was fraying slightly at the crown. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, without looking up. "Good morning, Agnes. You're looking very pale." Agnes made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "Well, it's not been an easy week, has it?" "No, it hasn't." Miss Marple selected a jar of pickled onions from the shelf. "Strange business, really. I always thought Thomas was rather unremarkable. Steady, punctual, a creature of habit. But it seems he had secrets." Agnes looked up sharply. "Secrets?" "Well, I suppose everyone does," Miss Marple said mildly. "We all have letters we wish hadn't been sent, or received, or read aloud." A flicker crossed Agnes's face. Not fear, not exactly. More like the blink of a curtain drawn just an inch too late. "I didn't know him well," Agnes said stiffly. "Not personally." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied. "Only I remember, some years back, there was an unpleasantness. Something to do with a misunderstanding over a parcel delivered to the wrong address. A matter involving your sister, wasn't it?" Agnes set down the tin she was holding with just a little too much care. "That was private." "Yes," said Miss Marple kindly. "But that's the trouble with letters, isn't it? They often begin private and end otherwise." For a long moment, Agnes said nothing. Then she turned away, walking to the back room with stiff shoulders and a trembling hand. Miss Marple left quietly. She returned home, where the fire had gone cold in the grate, and sat with the silence that told her the puzzle was moving into place. Someone had written a letter, hoping it would be delivered quietly. But Thomas, whether by design or accident, had not delivered it, or worse, had opened it. Miss Marple could think of only a few reasons a postman might violate that rule, and all of them came back to fear. Either he had suspected its contents, or recognized the handwriting. By mid-afternoon, she received a visit. Inspector Mallory, tall and precise as ever, stood at her door looking windblown and irritable. "I understand you've been asking questions," he said, not unkindly. Miss Marple smiled. "I find asking questions keeps the mind supple." "Supple or not, I'd appreciate it if you'd share anything useful directly with me." She motioned him to sit and poured him a cup of tea. When he was settled, she produced the torn letter fragment and the button. She laid them on the table like offerings. Mallory studied them both. "Where did you get these?" "I found the note behind the chapel path. The button near the reeds. It matches a cardigan worn by Agnes Whittle, though she's been rather shy about wearing it since." Mallory's brows drew together. "Why haven't you brought this sooner?" "Because observation precedes action," she replied gently. "One must understand context. Without that, a button is simply a button." Mallory glanced down at the items again, then back at her. "And your theory?" She lured him there. "I believe she feared something in the mail. Perhaps a letter exposing something from her past. Or maybe something more recent. And I believe she panicked." "She's not a violent woman," Mallory muttered. "No," Miss Marple said. "But desperation can make even gentle people do terrible things." Mallory sighed and stood. "I'll speak to her, but no assumptions, Miss Marple." "None," she agreed. "Only a hope that we're not too late." She watched him leave, then turned back to her window. The village was quiet again. But something beneath that quiet was changing. A truth, once buried, was beginning to rise, like silt stirred from the bottom of a pond. And Miss Marple, ever patient, was ready to see what else might float to the surface. The rain had tapered off by early evening, leaving behind a polished sheen on the streets of Nether Durnham. Water clung to the edges of window panes, and smoke rose gently from chimneys as households settled into the quiet rituals of supper. But inside the Whittle residence above the dry goods shop, the stillness had fractured. Agnes Whittle sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at a teacup she hadn't touched. Inspector Mallory's questions had begun politely, even sympathetically, but his tone had sharpened as he laid out the sequence of events: her missing button, her silence about the letter, her presence near the chapel path the night of Thomas Larkin's death. And Agnes had answered at first with rigid calm. But something in her voice had cracked when he mentioned the torn letter. Her hands trembled, and for a moment it seemed she might speak freely. Then she changed. Her mouth drew into a tight line, and her eyes became hard again, brittle with denial. "I've told you," she said. "I wasn't anywhere near that pond." Mallory had sighed and left with a warning. If anything came to light that contradicted her statement, she could be formally charged with obstruction. Now she sat alone in the echo of that visit, heart pounding against her ribs. Below, the shop was closed, but a faint creak on the stair startled her. She turned quickly, only the wind rattling the frame of the back door. Still she stood, checked the lock, and drew the curtain. Across the village, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, making no attempt to hide her tension. The button, the note, Agnes's sudden stony resolve. These pieces all fit, but the picture they formed still refused to come fully into view. There was more beneath the surface, something older, more personal. Miss Marple lit a lamp and returned to the small bundle of letters she'd collected over the years. Innocuous things, mostly holiday cards and invitations to village functions. But among them were 2 letters, both dated 6 years earlier, both addressed to Thomas Larkin. They had been part of a complaint lodged by the Denby family about a misdelivered envelope that revealed a confidential banking matter. Thomas had apologised in person, though he had insisted, gently but firmly, that the mistake hadn't been his. The curious thing was that Agnes Whittle had also been mentioned in passing during that complaint. Miss Marple remembered now. There had been rumours, quickly dismissed, that Agnes had been seen rifling through the post sack in the sorting room one morning. No one had taken it seriously then, but now. She held one of the letters to the light. The handwriting, rounded, precise, was not unlike the scrawl on the torn note recovered by the pond. Not identical, but similar in posture. And then there was the phrasing. "Never meant for you to see this." A line that could only come from someone whose guilt predated the letter itself. The next morning, Miss Marple stopped briefly at the greengrocer's, bought a single apple, and asked if young Daniel Roper might again run a message. This one was addressed to Eleanor Broom at the library. The reply came swiftly. Eleanor agreed to meet Miss Marple at St. Ethelburga's that afternoon. Not in the library, but discreetly in the rear garden where the herbs grew. At precisely 2, Miss Marple arrived, her gait slow but steady, her cane tapping once on the stone path as she entered the modest garden. Eleanor was already there, arms folded over her chest, face pale despite the warmth of the day. "You said it was about Geoffrey," she began, voice taut. "Has something happened?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But I believe something nearly did, that night by the chapel when he waited for you." Eleanor glanced away. "I told you. I never intended to meet him there." "I know," Miss Marple said, "because you never wrote that letter. It was sent in your name, but the hand was not yours. It was a trap, not for him, but for Thomas." There was silence. Eleanor looked at her, stricken. But why would anyone? Because Thomas may have known something that Agnes had worked hard to keep buried. Perhaps he received a letter, mistakenly or otherwise, that exposed a past indiscretion, or perhaps he simply saw what he wasn't meant to. Eleanor's lips trembled. "I don't believe she's capable of murder." Miss Marple nodded. "Neither do I. But desperation is a peculiar thing. And if she thought Thomas might speak, or had already spoken, she may have panicked." "She's not a violent woman," Eleanor whispered. "But she holds grudges." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And she likes to control what people know. That's the most dangerous kind of secrecy." That evening, the atmosphere in the village changed again. News spread that Constable Sims had recovered a page torn from the local church ledger, tucked at the back of the vestry bookshelf. It was folded tightly, as though hidden in haste, and bore only a short note in faint pencil. It wasn't an accident. She pushed him. No name, no signature, but it was dated the night of the murder. Mallory had it sent for analysis, though he doubted the handwriting would be traceable. Still, it was enough to renew pressure on Agnes, who had not appeared in her shop since the previous afternoon. By the time the sun dipped low and the village windows glowed golden with lamplight, Miss Marple stood once again at her front window, watching the chapel path. She had asked Geoffrey Banbury to do something bold, and she hoped not too reckless. It was just after 8:30 when she saw the boy appear. He walked slowly down the path behind the chapel, as he had done that night. But this time, instead of waiting in confusion, he knelt and tied his shoelace, just beside the patch of reeds where the flattened grass still bore the ghost of an old footprint. A shadow moved. From behind the low chapel wall, someone stepped out. Not young, not quick, but deliberate. Agnes Whittle. She said something low and sharp. Geoffrey stood slowly, backing away. Miss Marple couldn't hear the words, but she saw the moment Agnes reached forward, not violently, but with urgency, pleading almost. Geoffrey pulled back. Then he pointed, not at her, but toward the end of the path. Miss Marple stood in the clearing, her cane firmly planted beside her boot. Agnes froze. There was a long silence. Then she sank to the low stone wall and covered her face with both hands. "I didn't mean to," she said, barely above a whisper. "I only wanted to frighten him, to stop him from telling." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft but certain. "What was it, Agnes? What had Thomas learned?" Agnes didn't look up. "It was years ago. Just once. I read a letter. I shouldn't have. I copied something down. Blackmailed someone. It was stupid, cruel. I was young. But last week, a letter came. From the same person. He must have written to Thomas by mistake. Or maybe on purpose, threatening to expose everything. I saw the envelope when it passed through my shop. Recognized the handwriting." She exhaled sharply. "I wrote another letter. Pretended to be someone else. Told Thomas to meet me there. I only wanted to talk to him. But he saw me and he knew. And when he tried to leave, I stepped in his way. I didn't mean for him to fall, but he stumbled back. The mud. He slipped. And the button. I caught his sleeve to stop him," she whispered. "It tore. I ran. I didn't know what else to do." Miss Marple didn't move, only looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. "Even secrets," she said, "can die more gently than this." The bells of St. Ethelburga's chimed the hour behind them, and the village, still listening, heard the truth at last. The confession did not echo across the village like a bell toll. It did not burst from rooftops or ripple through the hedgerows with the urgency of gossip. Instead, it passed from one quiet voice to another, travelling gently, almost respectfully, through the quiet channels of Netherdurnham. Agnes Whittle was not arrested that night. Inspector Mallory, called swiftly to the scene by Miss Marple's note, already waiting on his desk when he returned from the constabulary, arrived just as the chapel bell finished its chime. Agnes did not resist, nor argue, nor weep. She stood as though she had aged 20 years in 20 minutes and walked with him to the station, escorted not by force, but by inevitability. She was charged with involuntary manslaughter. No malice, no intent to kill, but reckless actions, concealed truth, and a deliberate manipulation of trust. Agnes admitted to crafting the letter, to luring Thomas there, to confronting him with the hope of silencing a past indiscretion. But she had not expected him to fall. She had not expected the mud to give way, or the water to take him so fast. "I thought I could scare him," she had said to Mallory in the quiet of the interview room, her voice a husk. "He always listened. I thought he would understand." Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned home under a low violet sky, the clouds thin and stretched, as though the heavens themselves had exhaled. The village was quiet, but not still. Lamps flickered behind lace curtains, and small shadows moved through the narrow lanes, neighbours whispering what they now understood or thought they did. The truth, of course, was rarely so clean. Miss Marple sat in her parlour with a small pot of tea cooling beside her, and thought not of Agnes, but of Thomas. She thought of the way he had always paused to nod at her gate, how he had once gently rescued a kitten from the bakery's roof, how he always carried peppermints in his pocket for children who waited with eager hands on their doorsteps. He had not deserved such an end, and she suspected, in her quiet way, that Thomas had known far more than he ever revealed. That was why the next morning she asked to see the contents of the post sack. Inspector Mallory was sceptical. The sack had been delivered, unopened, to the regional office, its contents catalogued and scanned, nothing missing, nothing abnormal. But Miss Marple insisted. There had been a letter, she said, that did not belong. One inserted, not posted. A trap disguised as routine. Reluctantly, Mallory agreed. He arranged for the bag to be returned and for its contents to be reviewed once more. Not by machines or clerks, but by eye. Carefully, deliberately. And there it was. A plain envelope. No return address. No stamp. No postal mark. Simply inserted among the others, as if it had always belonged. The letter inside was typewritten, cold, precise, and unsigned. It read, "You thought no one would ever know. But I know. You buried your shame behind church hymns and tea cakes, but I saw what you did. I kept the copy. If I tell what I know, your name will mean nothing. You will lose everything, unless you make it right. One meeting, one conversation, behind the chapel." Yettemuppade. Miss Marple read it only once. Then she folded it, placed it gently on the table, and looked at Mallory. This was meant for Thomas, or so Agnes believed, but it was meant to frighten her. Mallory frowned. "You're saying she wasn't protecting herself? She was being blackmailed?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. She believed she was. That's why she panicked. But that letter wasn't written by the person she feared. It was written by someone who wanted her to panic. Mallory stared at her, then at the letter. But who? Why? "I don't know yet," Miss Marple admitted quietly. "But it wasn't Agnes who pushed Thomas. I no longer believe that." Mallory blinked. "But she confessed to confronting him, to grabbing his sleeve, to panic. But look at this letter, Inspector. Does it sound like something she would write herself? Would she incriminate herself so deeply?" Mallory opened his mouth, then closed it. He rubbed his temples. "I'll have it checked for fingerprints," he said finally. "Do," Miss Marple said. "And while you wait, speak to Eleanor Broom again." Eleanor. She was the only one who knew that Geoffrey was waiting behind the chapel that night. Yet somehow that exact spot was chosen for Thomas's meeting. Eleanor told no one, except perhaps one person. And that person used the knowledge to draw Thomas in. Mallory stared. "You think she's involved?" "I think someone used her," Miss Marple replied. Or perhaps she allowed herself to be used. Either way, the chapel was chosen deliberately. Later that afternoon, Mallory returned with confirmation. The letter had one partial fingerprint, not Agnes's, not Eleanor's, not Thomas's. It belonged to Geoffrey Banbury. Miss Marple said nothing at first. Then she nodded, very slightly, and closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, her voice was almost tender. He was afraid. That's why he lied. That's why he confessed to being there when he hadn't planned to be. I wondered why he claimed to have heard a splash. No one else did. Mallory frowned. You think he forged the letter? I think he meant it as a joke, or a test, or an act of petty revenge. Young men with romantic hopes are not always stable thinkers. Eleanor rebuffed him, perhaps harshly, perhaps after he had seen her speaking with Thomas. You think he wanted to frighten Eleanor? I think he used the chapel path to draw her out, but Thomas went instead. And when he saw Thomas, I believe he panicked. The inspector rubbed his chin. You think he pushed him? I think Thomas fell, just as Agnes claimed, but Geoffrey was there. He saw it, and he ran. Mallory stood abruptly. We'll question him again. But it was unnecessary. That evening, Geoffrey Banbury came to Miss Marple's cottage of his own accord. He looked pale, worn, and far older than his 19 years. I didn't mean for any of it to happen, he whispered. It was a joke, just a joke. I thought Eleanor would, I don't know, think it was daring, romantic. She'd been so cold. I wanted to prove I wasn't invisible. He sat heavily in the chair opposite Miss Marple and covered his face with both hands. I saw Thomas come down the path. I didn't know he'd found the letter. I just hid behind the wall. I was going to say something, scare him off, but then Agnes came from the other direction. They argued. He tried to leave. She stepped in front of him. He slipped. I heard the splash, and then she ran. Miss Marple sat in silence. I should have helped, Geoffrey whispered. I should have shouted, but I froze. She reached forward and took his hand, thin and cold. We do foolish things when we're young, she said softly, but we must learn from them, or we carry them forever. Geoffrey turned himself in that night, escorted by his father and Miss Marple. He was not charged with murder, nor even manslaughter, but his letter, that one cruel invention, had set everything in motion. Agnes had acted in fear. Thomas had died by accident, and Nether Durnham, quiet once more, had learned that even the smallest deceit could ripple out like a stone in still water, disturbing far more than intended. In the days that followed, life resumed. The bakery reopened. The post was delivered again. The chapel bell rang on schedule, and in her garden Miss Marple planted snowdrops by the fence. They bloom, she said one morning to the vicar, just when you've nearly forgotten to. Expect beauty. And the vicar, nodding thoughtfully, said nothing at all. By the time Geoffrey's confession was recorded, the air in Nether Durnham had shifted once more. Not cleared exactly, but settled into a new, uncertain quiet. A kind of hush followed his admission, the village stunned not by the crime itself, which had proved more accident than murder, but by the realization that the root of it had been something so tragically small. A gesture, a prank, a hurt feeling in the heart of a boy, too clever for his own good. Miss Marple had seen it before, not often, but enough times to know that recklessness born of youth was no less dangerous than malice. It carried no calculation, no cold blood, only the burn of impulse, the desperate hunger to matter, to be seen. In her sitting room that evening, she sat with her shawl tucked high on her shoulders, knitting not with haste, but with a steady rhythm, the way one rocks a restless child to sleep. The click of her needles echoed softly, almost companionably, through the house. Outside, the street lamps flickered on one by one, as if reclaiming the night. A letter had started all of this, or rather, the illusion of one. A boy had tried to create tension between two people. He had faked a message, drawn it up in anonymity, and planted it not just in the post sack, but in the natural flow of the village, trusting, perhaps arrogantly, that he understood the game well enough to play it. But people, Miss Marple reflected, are not pieces on a board. They come with old wounds, buried fears, shameful truths that do not fit into tidy boxes. Agnes had panicked because the letter, though fake, rang true in a place she had spent years trying to forget. And Thomas, ever gentle, had gone to meet the ghost of someone else's secret. The next morning, Inspector Mallory arrived at Miss Marple's cottage not in haste, but with a calm resolve. He carried no notepad, wore no scowl. Instead, he brought a modest brown paper parcel tied with string. He handed it to her wordlessly, then stepped inside when she gestured toward the hearth. "Thomas Larkin's personal effects," he said, sitting in the armchair she offered. "Recovered from the sorting office yesterday. Thought you might want to see them before they're boxed away for good. No family to claim them, it seems." Miss Marple accepted the parcel with a gentle nod. She undid the string carefully, without tearing the paper, as though handling something sacred. Inside, a worn leather wallet, a small ring of keys, a handkerchief embroidered with an initial that had nearly worn away, and a single book, slim, with creased corners and a dog-eared spine. She opened the cover. On Human Kindness and Other Observations. It was an old print, mid-century, faded gold lettering. Inside, on the first page, was a penciled note in Thomas's handwriting. Page 42. What Agnes never understood. Her fingers lingered on the words. Mallory leaned in slightly. She turned to the page. The passage read, "It is not the sin itself that destroys the soul, but the silence that follows it. To speak, even in shame, is to begin again." They sat in silence for a moment. "He knew," Miss Marple said quietly. "He must have remembered what she had done years ago, or perhaps she told him once and thought he'd forgotten." Mallory nodded. "You believe he was trying to help her?" "I do. He was the sort who didn't carry grudges. He carried knowledge, quietly, gently, and when he thought someone might suffer for too long in silence, I think he wanted to let her speak, or give her the chance to." Mallory leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "And instead, she feared exposure." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Because fear lives longer than truth, Inspector, especially when left alone too long." He was quiet for a time. Then he rose, touched the edge of his hat out of respect, and left her to her thoughts. Later that day, word came that Geoffrey Banbury had been sent away to his uncle's farm in Dorset. No formal charges were brought, though the official caution on his record would stay there for some years. His father, stiff-lipped and wounded, had issued a curt apology to the village on his behalf and asked for understanding. It was not received warmly, but neither was it met with outrage. Agnes Whittle, still under formal watch, had agreed to close her shop and vacate the upper flat. Her solicitor, summoned from Eastbourne, made arrangements for a distant cousin to settle her affairs. She would not return. Her final statement, given through tears and without denial, asked only that the village remember her for something other than the fall. Eleanor Broom, perhaps the only figure whose name never quite made the centre of the storm, returned quietly to her post at the library. She kept her head down, eyes lowered, and wore her hair a little looser at the crown. Miss Marple suspected she had not yet forgiven herself, not for what she had done, but for what she had failed to see. As for the village, it began slowly to resume its shape. The chapel garden was cleared of police tape. The pond behind it remained still and unvisited. And when Thomas's bicycle was finally removed from the war memorial, it was not scrapped or discarded. The village council agreed, at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, to have it painted, repaired, and mounted near the chapel gate, alongside a modest plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas Larkin, who carried not just letters, but kindness." Miss Marple watched the plaque unveiling from a bench near the vestry path. She said nothing during the ceremony, offered no speech, and accepted no credit. But those who knew her watched the way her eyes lingered on the empty path behind the chapel, and they understood. The days that followed were unremarkable, deliberately so. Rain returned, laundry lines fluttered. The grocer's chalkboard once again advertised apples in crates, and the vicar resumed his weekly lectures on moral modesty, now with a tone more subdued than usual. On Thursday, Miss Marple returned a borrowed book to Eleanor with a kind word and a freshly baked lemon biscuit wrapped in wax paper. Eleanor didn't speak, but she accepted it with both hands, and something in her posture shifted. On Friday, a small boy, Daniel Roper, delivered a thank-you note written in careful print. It was addressed to Miss M and contained only one sentence. "I'm glad you were watching." She pinned it quietly to the inside of her pantry door. That weekend, she hosted her niece and two great-nieces for tea. The house was filled with laughter and tiny spoons clinking against teacups. When one of the girls asked her, with a child's seriousness, whether she'd ever solved a real mystery, Miss Marple smiled and said only, "Well, sometimes the hardest mystery is remembering how to forgive people, and how to let them do the same." After they left, she sat again by her window, watching the fading light pool in puddles across the lane. She thought of Geoffrey's trembling hands, of Agnes's hunched back as she stepped into the station, of Thomas's careful handwriting tucked in the first page of a forgotten book. The postman who never left a letter had, in the end, delivered far more than he knew. And as the sun set behind the chapel, Miss Marple whispered a line she'd read long ago and never forgotten. A village never forgets its secrets, but sometimes it forgives them. And in that forgiveness, life, quietly, gently, moved on. The days that followed were not without echoes. Though the village of Nether Durnham had returned to its customary pace, of hedgerows trimmed, milk bottles clinking on stone steps, and Sunday sermons drifting over the churchyard wall, a peculiar quiet still lingered. Not the hush of fear anymore, nor even shame, but the thoughtful kind of silence that settles when people have looked too closely at themselves and are still deciding what to do with what they've seen. Miss Marple understood that kind of silence. It was the space between the knowing and the speaking, and often the most honest part of any confession. She had taken to her garden again. Spring's first crocuses had begun to push through the damp soil, delicate and defiant. As she knelt to trim the browned leaves from the base of her camellias, she thought of Thomas Larkin. How he had always admired her flowers in passing, never intruding, never presuming, only offering a quiet, looking lovely Miss M as he passed the gate. It was strange how many pieces of a life could be remembered, not in dramatic flashes, but in these small, steady moments. A voice, a glance, a habit of kindness. Thomas had been full of such things. So when Eleanor Broom came knocking that Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand, and eyes unusually red-rimmed, Miss Marple knew at once the girl had not come about overdue books. "May I sit?" Eleanor asked, once ushered inside. "Of course, dear." They sat across from each other, the tea tray between them, untouched. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said at last, "about what might have happened if I'd said something sooner." "You told the truth," Miss Marple said gently. "Eventually." "Yes, but not before someone died. Not before others got hurt." Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she poured the tea, handed Eleanor a cup, and said quietly, "Most people speak only when they believe they will still be liked afterward. It's braver, I think, to speak when they fear they won't." Eleanor said nothing for a while. Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope. "This came through the interlibrary post last week. It was misrouted, came from a smaller branch near Woking. It's addressed to Thomas, dated the day before he died." Miss Marple took the envelope. The handwriting was careful, looped and unhurried. A woman's hand, likely. It bore no return address, only a postmark, blurred but just legible. She unfolded the letter and read, "Dear Thomas, I know you will be surprised to hear from me after all this time, but there are things I never said, and things I now feel I must make right before it's too late. I wronged someone once, a girl from your village, and I fear my silence helped someone else do worse in my name. I know now it was Agnes Whittle who copied my letter. She used my story to her own end. I never meant harm, only to disappear. I've enclosed the original letter. Do what you think is right. You always did. M. There was no enclosure, only a ghost of one. The top of the page showed signs of tearing. A second sheet had been removed. Miss Marple exhaled slowly and set the letter down. I suspect, she said, that Thomas did indeed receive this, and that he intended to confront Agnes, not to shame her, but to offer a chance for her to come clean herself. He carried this letter with him, most likely, or left it somewhere he thought safe. Eleanor looked down. But it wasn't found on him. No, Miss Marple murmured, because someone else took it, or found it later, and feared what it contained. She stood and went to her sideboard, where her recipe book, with the inspector's first note still tucked inside, now rested beneath a fresh stack of post. From within, she withdrew the torn sheet she had discovered by the pond days ago, the one with the smudged handwriting and the phrase, "Never meant for you to see this." She laid it beside the new letter. Same paper stock. Same faded typewriter ink. Eleanor leaned in. But if the original letter was enclosed with this, and if Thomas carried it, that means someone else took it after he died? Or just before, Miss Marple said. And perhaps copied part of it, rewrote it, reworded it as a threat. Geoffrey, Eleanor whispered. He must have found it, and then written his own version to make it look like someone else was blackmailing Agnes. Exactly, Miss Marple said softly. He likely never understood the full context, only that it mentioned Agnes and wrongdoing and something hidden. He saw an opportunity to push people into motion. Eleanor's face flushed with shame. I introduced them, Geoffrey and Agnes. I told her he was clever, bright. I thought he could help with the shop's accounting. I thought he was harmless. No one is ever entirely harmless, Eleanor, Miss Marple replied gently. Only sometimes lost. The next day, Miss Marple walked to the station with the letter in hand. Inspector Mallory accepted it without comment, reading it through twice before exhaling deeply. More ghosts, he muttered, just when I thought we'd laid them all to rest. They never rest, Miss Marple said. They only wait for the living to do so. Mallory closed the file slowly. Well, this doesn't change the charge. Agnes still lured him there. Geoffrey still fled the scene. No, Miss Marple agreed. But perhaps it changes how we remember them. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home to find a small parcel waiting at her doorstep. No note, no name. But the wrapping was neat and the tape cleanly folded, the kind of precision that came from thoughtful hands. Inside, a small brown notebook, worn at the corners. She opened it carefully. It was Thomas's. Inside, each page held a quote, a line from a sermon, a remark from a neighbour, a fragment of overheard poetry. No dates, no explanations, only sentences gathered over years of quiet listening. One, on the final page, was written in darker ink than the others. Sometimes the kindest thing one can do with a secret is to carry it gently, until the one who must speak is ready. Miss Marple closed the book, placed it on the shelf beside her tea tin, and stood at the window as the light faded again over the village. In the distance, a new postman pedalled up the lane, his bag bouncing lightly against his side. The gate creaked. The bell above the bakery chimed faintly. And somewhere in the soft folds of the dusk, Nether Durnham turned another quiet page. The morning after the notebook arrived, Miss Marple awoke before the sun had fully crested the rooftops of Nether Durnham. The village was still tucked in shadow, dew settling along hedges and roof tiles like a hush over spoken things. She lay in bed a moment longer than usual, listening to the world's soft breath through the open window. the rustle of a bird in the ivy, the creak of wood expanding in the warmth. There was something unfinished still, not in the law's eyes perhaps, but in her own quiet sense of truth. She rose, dressed, and slipped the brown notebook into her bag. The phrase Thomas had, written on the final page, echoed through her mind like a soft bell. Sometimes the kindest thing one can do with a secret is to carry it gently, until the one who must speak is ready. She had always known that Thomas understood people far better than most gave him credit for. He had watched the village not as an observer, but as a custodian of its quiet rhythms, its unspoken regrets, its small reconciliations. But one secret remained unanswered. Why had Thomas waited? If he had known the letter's contents, if he'd understood what Agnes had done and how it had affected others, why hadn't he brought it forward sooner? Why hold such a burden so long? Miss Marple knew where to go to answer that question. She arrived at the church just as Reverend McInnes was unlocking the front door. He gave her a kindly smile, the kind that priests reserve for those who ask few questions and know far too much. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I take it you're not here for early confession." "No, Reverend," she said gently. "Only for a few quiet truths." He tilted his head. "You think the church still has some left?" She gave him a small smile. "I think Thomas left one here, and I believe you helped him keep it." They sat in the front pew, two solitary figures in the vast hush of old stone and filtered light. Dust floated in the slanted beams above the altar. The air smelled of oil and worn wood. Miss Marple withdrew the notebook and placed it in the vicar's hands. "He quoted from your sermon here," she said, "multiple times, but the one on the last page, I believe it was from a conversation, not a pulpit." Reverend McInnes turned to the final page and read it silently. His shoulders rose and then slowly dropped. "Yes," he said at last. "That was mine. He asked me about forgiveness, not for himself, for someone else. I didn't press him. I could see it was a grief he wasn't ready to name, but I offered what I could." He closed the notebook and passed it back to her with care. "I believe," he continued, "that he waited not out of cowardice, but mercy. He didn't want Agnes exposed. He hoped she would come to it herself. I think he was trying to help her carry the weight just long enough that she might one day put it down." Miss Marple nodded, and for a moment they sat in a silence that held no tension, only reverence. "But something changed," she murmured. "Yes," said the Reverend. "Someone else interfered. Geoffrey's letter, that cruel mimicry, shattered the quiet Thomas had preserved. Agnes thought the worst, and by the time Thomas realized the misunderstanding, it was too late. The weight of it settled between them like an old coat. Miss Marple stood, slow but certain. "Thank you, Reverend. That fills in the last missing piece." She left the church with the early sun finally rising above the village roofs, gilding the bricks and windows in quiet fire. The bakery door was propped open to cool, fresh loaves steaming in the dawn air. The smell of yeast and butter rolled down the street. A bicycle bell chimed, not Thomas's, but it would do. Miss Marple turned toward the green, where the newly painted bicycle stood beneath the plaque. She read the inscription again, her hand brushing the handlebars gently. "In memory of Thomas Larkin, who carried not just letters, but kindness." She turned and found Inspector Mallory approaching from the corner. He had the look of a man who had come not to deliver judgment, but to receive understanding. "I've read the letter," he said, skipping formalities. "The one you brought from Eleanor, and the page from the notebook." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then you know he never intended to expose anyone, only to offer her a chance." "Yes, and we missed that. In the noise and the panic, we all missed the fact that he'd spent years trying to shield people from harm, even those who didn't deserve it." Miss Marple regarded him for a moment, then said, "That's always the danger, Inspector. Goodness rarely shouts." He looked out across the green, hands deep in his coat pockets. "We won't reopen the case. The charges stand as they are. Geoffrey's record is marked. Agnes has chosen exile, but I'll be amending the official report. The conclusion will reflect the truth, or as much of it as the law allows." "That will be enough," Miss Marple said. He glanced at her. "You always manage to see the threads before the rest of us." "How?" She smiled faintly. "Because people leave patterns, Inspector. They don't know they're doing it, but they do. In their silences, their kindnesses, the way they avoid certain names, or return to the same phrases. And once you see the pattern, the rest unfolds." Mallory nodded. "Well, I hope the next mystery's a bit simpler." "Oh," Miss Marple said mildly. "I should rather hope not." He chuckled and tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Marple." "Good day, Inspector." As he walked off toward the station, she turned one last time to the bicycle. That evening, as the sun set behind the fields and the lane glowed with the faint warmth of late spring, Miss Marple sat once more at her desk. She wrote a short letter, not to the police, nor to the village council, but to the woman whose name had never fully been revealed. "Dear M, your letter reached the right hands, even if it arrived too late for the man who carried it. Thomas protected more than just secrets. He protected the space for them to be made right. I hope you've found peace. I hope one day Agnes does too. As for the village, it remembers, but gently now, and I believe that's enough. Yours, J.M." She folded it, sealed it in a plain envelope, and placed it in the drawer by the window. She had no address to send it to, but some letters were not meant to travel far, only to be written and understood. Outside, a young child on a scooter paused by the gate and waved. Miss Marple waved back. Then she sat, picked up her needles, and returned to the shawl she had abandoned during the long weeks of inquiry. The wool was warm in her hands, the rhythm familiar, and as the stitches gathered slowly beneath her fingers, the world beyond her garden grew quiet and whole again. The post had come. The secrets had passed, and in the stillness that followed, kindness endured. The village of Nether Durnham, in the weeks that followed, did not so much forget as it quietly folded the story away, like a well-worn letter returned to its envelope and tucked into a drawer. The shock had dulled into reflection, and though voices still lowered when speaking of Thomas Larkin or Agnes Whittle, there was no longer fear behind them, only a soft kind of reverence. Miss Marple, who had walked each step of the mystery with silent clarity, found herself once again at the vicarage garden one bright morning, where crocuses bloomed beneath the stone wall and bees stirred lazily above the rosemary. Reverend McInnes was pruning a climbing rose with more persistence than skill, and when she approached, he lowered his shears with a smile. "I suppose we've returned to the ordinary at last," he said. "There's no such thing as ordinary in a village," Miss Marple replied, settling herself onto the stone bench. "Only quieter chapters between the louder ones." He chuckled, then sobered. "I'm still thinking of Agnes, and of Geoffrey. What might have happened if any one of us had simply asked the right questions sooner?" Miss Marple nodded. "We often assume people will speak when they're ready. But shame can be a very long silence, Reverend, and youth, especially the kind Geoffrey carries, rarely understands the depth of a spark it strikes." The Reverend looked out toward the churchyard, where the repaired gate now bore a fresh coat of paint. "Still, you saw it before the rest of us, the shape of it all." "I didn't know," she said softly. "But I noticed. Thomas's abandoned postbag, the letter that hadn't passed through proper sorting, the button with the cream thread, all small things. But the small things always tell the truth, if we're willing to believe them." She stood slowly, brushing a few petals from her skirt. "I've always thought it a mistake that people view evil as something loud, something theatrical, but I've rarely found that to be the case. More often it's hesitation, fear, a failure to act, and sometimes just a thoughtless act from someone who hasn't yet learned what damage silence can do. That afternoon, a parcel arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. No note, no sender, just plain brown paper tied with twine. Inside was a copy of On Human Kindness and Other Observations, newly bound. Tucked between its pages was a photograph. Thomas Larkin, in his younger years, standing with his bicycle in front of the post office. He was not smiling, not in the obvious camera-ready way, but something in his eyes suggested kindness, the kind that rarely needs to announce itself. She placed it on her shelf beside the original volume, then sat at her table and began to write. Her letter was addressed to Geoffrey Banbury. Dear Geoffrey, I do not write to judge you. That is not my place. But I believe you deserve more than silence now. I believe you deserve to understand fully the outcome of your actions, not as a punishment, but as a way to grow past them. Thomas Larkin never held your name in anger. He had, in fact, written your name in his notebook once, beside a sermon quote that read, "Those who stumble need not carry the stone forever. You will carry this memory, but you may also carry it wisely. Let it shape you. Let it soften you. That would be the only justice Thomas ever truly asked for. Yours sincerely, J. Marple." She sealed it, addressed it to Dorset, and handed it off to the new postman with a nod. The following Sunday, the village gathered in St. Ethelburga's for the Spring Choral Festival, a tradition long held and, for once, uninterrupted by death or scandal. Miss Marple sat in the fourth pew, her knitting tucked into her bag, and listened as the final hymn rose through the nave, filling the ancient stone with something like absolution. When the last note faded, she stepped out into the sunlit churchyard, where new green had crept over the winter's brown, and the wind carried the scent of rosemary and bread from the village beyond. She paused by the memorial bike, her eyes resting for a moment on the plaque. In memory of Thomas Larkin, who carried not just letters, but kindness. There was nothing more to be said, no dramatic monologue, no stern confrontation. The mystery had been solved, not just in the sense of names and actions, but in understanding. And understanding, Miss Marple thought, was the truest justice of all. She turned from the gate and walked slowly home, her shadow long behind her, her steps light. Spring was here now, and with it came new letters, new afternoons, and, always, the quiet certainty that in every village, no matter how peaceful, truth will out, even if it arrives by post, years delayed, in the hand of a boy who never meant to be cruel, or a woman who once chose silence. And as the clouds drifted apart above the rooftops of Nether Durnham, Miss Marple, faithful observer of all things quietly human, let the story rest.